Our first speaker is Tim Judson, Executive Director of NIRS, Nuclear Information and Resource Service. If you have any questions about nuclear, go to NIRS, NIRS.org. Tim works both nationally and internationally on nuclear issues. For example, Tim attended and organized international participant anti-nuclear events at the UN Paris Climate Conference in 2015. He holds weekly national Zoom calls about nuclear issues and now emergency the COVID-19 is causing in some nuclear power plants and the nuclear industry. Tim?
Thank you, Catherine, and thanks to the New York City group of the Sierra Club for organizing this event. It's really great to see everybody here and hope we can have some good exchange of information and views tonight. As Catherine mentioned, I'm with an organization called the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, which is a national environmental group that was founded in 1978 to be kind of a national resource and information resource and networking hub for the grassroots environmental movement concerned about nuclear power, radioactive waste, and how we can transition to sustainable energy. But I actually come from New York. I got my start doing this work over 20 years ago as a grassroots activist in Syracuse, and then later in New York City, and helped with the fight against the Indian Point nuclear power plant. I've been at NIRS since 2013. To kind of get started, it's really appropriate that we talk about the impact of the pandemic in the context, the impact of the pandemic on the nuclear industry in the context of climate action. As you're going to hear from the other presenters tonight, nuclear power is vulnerable to the impacts of global warming, and it also compounds many of the dangers of the climate crisis. The pandemic has really brought another dimension of that to light, as I'm going to talk about. To kind of start with, when people think about nuclear power, they think about the machines and the iconic structures, and often the dangers of a meltdown and radioactive waste. But we don't often think of nuclear power plants as workplaces, as places where people go to work every day. And with the coronavirus, we really need to change our perspective on that. Nuclear workers are really the front line and the last line of defense for nuclear safety. And right now, they are not being protected by their employers and by the regulators of this industry. That's resulted in some pretty alarming statistics. There's the cases of coronavirus infection are mounting at reactor sites. Just as a few examples, since there's no systematic reporting of the instance of COVID-19 at reactor sites, we're having to rely on anecdotal reports in the media. But just as an example, the Fermi 2 reactor in Michigan, there's potentially up to 300 cases of coronavirus infection out of a workforce of 2,000 there. The Vogtle Plant Vogtle construction site where they're building 2 new reactors in Georgia. There were over 209 cases reported as of Monday, and at the Grand Gulf reactor site in Mississippi, where they had a refueling outage last month. There was a report leaked by some of the workers that there were over 90 there were 89 workers infected with coronavirus at that time. And what you had to understand is that nuclear reactor sites are generally in rural or suburban communities, and so these are small communities with small populations, and and as we've been learning through the pandemic, really limited medical infrastructure. And so, with these, power plants that are very large employers, nuclear power is very different than just about every other type of electricity generation. Where it takes a few dozen workers to operate a coal plant or a natural gas plant. A typical nuclear reactor site has 600 to 1,000 permanent employees, and so these are really large workforces who work under conditions that make it really difficult to do things like social distancing and sanitation. When workers show up at the reactor site, they had to go through a series of security checkpoints, radiation scanners, bomb sniffers, and these sort of things. And so they're in long lines, waiting to get into the plant, through these security checkpoints. And so we're hearing lots of reports from workers at reactor sites where there's just not any sanitation or social distancing being practiced. And when there's been some instances where reactor owners have tried to adopt some protocols, workers are standing in line for very long periods of time. It's slowing down the process of getting into work. And so the industry seems to be placing expediency ahead of the safety of their workers. And, given the critical role that nuclear workers play in protecting the public health and safety from the risks of an accident or, radioactive waste spills, the protection of these workers is really critical to all of us, and they deserve to be protected more than they are. So another thing that's happening, and this has been coming out over the last few months, and this is actually a regular occurrence. Every 18 to 24 months, every reactor in the country has to shut down for a few weeks to a month or more for what they call refueling. It's where they take about a third of the fuel assemblies out of the reactor core, place them in what's called the irradiated fuel pool. This is the really hot nuclear waste that we're familiar with thinking about. And then they put in, and they replace that fuel with a third of a reactor core's worth of fresh, enriched uranium fuel. These refueling outages are also typically times where the industry is scheduling inspections and maintenance that they don't want to shut the reactor down for at other times. And so they're really packing tremendous amounts of work and projects into these refueling outages, which typically involve bringing in somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 temporary workers and contractors onto these reactor sites in these rural communities. And there's really what's called sort of like a rotating workforce of these refueling outage workers who in the spring and the fall, go from reactor site to reactor site for these jobs to help with the refuelings. Which is just a standard way that the industry operates normally. But has raised tremendous risks during the pandemic. Now they're introducing hundreds or up to 1,000 or more new workers at these already crowded sites. They're not doing social distancing. They're not having enough sanitation or testing. These are small rural communities where you find, like for instance, with the Limerick plant in Pennsylvania. There were 1,400 refueling workers that were brought in. They were staying at 40 different sites over a 3-county area. And the local officials asked the owner of the plant, Exelon, not to proceed with the refueling until they had better protections, and testing for the workers in place. And the utility company refused to do so and just proceeded with the outage. So what we're seeing is, as the spring has gone on, and there's been 30 refuelings so far across the country, is that and spanning the beginning of the pandemic, that infection rates now here in May are starting to really get critical at some of these sites. Where you've got like at Fermi, potentially 300 workers infected, and they're now having to postpone the refueling operations because they don't have enough. They don't have a way to protect the workers adequately. What's also happening is that the industry has been using this as an opportunity to cut some costs by postponing pre-scheduled safety inspections. Many of these are required by regulation, but the industry has been petitioning the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, potentially for dozens, if not hundreds, of exemptions and postponements and deferrals of inspections and maintenance work. So there's now also potentially a nuclear safety impact to the pandemic because, for instance, with some of these critical inspections, they're being postponed until the next refueling outage, 18 to 24 months away. And so what we've seen happen in the past is when, inspections have been deferred at reactors, even for a few weeks or a few months, there's been safety incidents that have resulted from that, from equipment failing. That happened actually at the Indian Point 2 reactor back in 2000. So, there is now sort of this overhanging increase in nuclear safety risk that's happening around the country because of these deferred safety inspections and maintenance that are happening. The natural question is, what is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the nuclear industry doing in response to this? And the answer is really, not enough, and in some cases, nothing. For instance, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has decided to lift the limits on overtime and work hour limits for workers from what's normally 72 hours a week to 86 hours a week during the pandemic. This is, of course, going to lead to increased levels of fatigue among the workers, reducing their ability to fight off infection if they get it. And generally increasing the fatigue of workers isn't good for safety either. The NRC is not requiring any tracking or reporting or testing or tracing of infections, within the nuclear workforce, and it has not engaged any other federal agency, to help with this, to help sort of mitigate the impact of the pandemic within the nuclear workforce. And as I mentioned before, they're also granting dozens, if not hundreds, of exemptions and deferrals for inspections and maintenance requirements for up to 2 years. Another critical piece of this, of what the NRC has failed to do, is that whenever there's a natural disaster or actually a pandemic, the NRC is required by regulation to coordinate with the Federal Emergency Management Agency to have a review done of all of the emergency response plans for affected reactor sites. These are the 10-mile evacuation zones and the other measures that are taken in response to a disaster. And NRC has failed to engage FEMA to do these reviews of the emergency response plans for reactors across the country. So what needs to be done? A couple weeks ago, 86 organizations across the country, including NIRS, sent a letter to Vice President Pence, who is chair of the coronavirus task force, calling for 6 specific actions that need to be taken in order to get the impact of the pandemic under control within the nuclear industry. So the first thing is that they need to convene an interagency COVID-19 nuclear task force, engaging all of the relevant federal agencies to come up with, to evaluate the health and safety impacts on the workers, the safety impacts on the public, and to come up with procedures and protocols to be able to protect workers and the communities surrounding nuclear power plants. They need to order an immediate halt to additional refueling outages and decommissioning operations at reactor sites, until they get these protocols in place. So that the chances of spread among the workers in those communities are mitigated. They need to reevaluate the decision to increase the work hour limits for the nuclear workforce in order to, again, protect these workers from and their health and the safety of the communities. They need to do these disaster-initiated reviews of the emergency response plans with FEMA immediately. And all of the requests for postponements and exemptions from safety inspections and maintenance work need to be reevaluated in the context of the pandemic and the additional risk that this is posing to the public. And they also need to ensure that any potential safety impacts or the impacts of exemptions that have already been granted are fully mitigated, so that we're not living with increased risk of a nuclear disaster over the next 2 years. And then, one of the arguments that the industry has made to support continuing these operations during the pandemic has been, the need to ensure that the lights stay on during the pandemic. We have these claims have not been demonstrated in any way, and so what they need to do is work with federal energy regulators to do an analysis of every nuclear power plant in the country to see which ones are actually needed for the reliability of our electric grid, and which ones could afford to stay down for a while if necessary, while we get the impact of the pandemic under control. So what can you do? So there's a number of things that are really important, because the White House has not responded to this letter in the same way that their response to the pandemic has been lackluster. So we really need for people to be contacting the White House and your members of Congress demanding action on this. NIRS has put out an email action where you can email your Congress members in the White House directly, which you'll find on our website, and I can share the link at some point if that's possible. You could also contact your governors and state officials. They are actually going to be a potentially really powerful voice in motivating action from the White House, because it's of course the states and local communities that are most affected here. And then it's really important that this issue get talked about more in the media to get some of this attention. And so we encourage people to be writing letters to the editor and those sort of things as well. So thanks. That's my presentation.
Thank you, Tim. That was absolutely wonderful. There's so much information in there. I hadn't realized, the extent of the COVID in these power plants. It's really kind of concerning. Here's a question. At last report, back channel, at Fermi 2 in Michigan, there are more than 300 coronavirus positives, with hundreds more self-isolating. Detroit Edison has declared an extended safety stand down, yet the numbers have not yet been reported by the media. This is one of the single largest coronavirus clusters in Michigan and the worst outbreak I know of in the nuclear industry. Could you comment on that in some way that you might like?
Yeah, Fermi is a case in point in the industry, and I think it's also telling, because Fermi, we've been having these refueling outages at reactor sites happening starting in February, and we've been calling for these actions that I just described for over a month now. Fermi went ahead with a refueling outage. It's one of the last ones this season to start, and so what we're seeing is that they've got this potentially tremendous rate of infections on the reactor site now. With the new workers, the temporary workers that came to the community for the refueling, the total number of employees that are at Fermi is about 2,000 right now. And so for there to be up to 300 infections currently means that potentially 15% of the workforce is already infected with this virus. It's far higher, obviously, than the general population. And again, the Fermi reactor is located in a little community called Monroe, south of Detroit, which doesn't have a lot of medical infrastructure. And so one of the things that we're seeing is that local officials are having a problem with figuring out how much of an impact the coronavirus is having through these reactor sites, because when someone becomes infected, their infection is reported to the county where their home address is. And so for these reactor communities where you've got a lot of itinerant workers who are traveling from other communities to work there for a week or two, those cases that may have occurred in their community or be impacting their community are not being reported to those local communities. Are being reported to whatever community those workers came from. And so it's been really hard for local officials to get a real bead on how this intersection of the nuclear industry and the pandemic is affecting them.
Thank you, Tim. I think we can take one more question, and then I believe it'll be time for the poll. This one participant would like to know, has anybody talked to the unions, to the union leadership about this?
People have tried, and the union leadership have been in a tough position. What's been happening is that when workers start asking questions of the reactor owners about the lack of protection and how unsafe they've been feeling, they've been told, well, look, you can stay home if you want, but you're not going to get paid. And I mean, so both for the workers that are, you know, permanently employed at the plants, and with these contractors who are completely dependent on these temporary jobs that they get, they can't afford, you know, to not get paid. And so the unions, you know, have, for better or worse, not been speaking out about this, you know, in some ways to ensure that their members don't get put out of work by the pandemic. It's really, you know, it's really been a very complicated thing, and it's why we as the public need to be speaking out for the workers, because it's hard for them to do it for themselves right now.
Thank you, Tim. Out of curiosity, are most of the workers wearing face masks?
It seems to vary site by site, but it's also just really hard for them to do that because they've got other protective gear that they need to wear, you know, because they're working in a radioactive environment. And so, you know, in a lot of cases, you know, I mean, these reactors, you know, the reactor buildings, you know, if you're doing work near the reactor, it's extremely hot. There's, you know, you're talking about hundreds of degrees, you know, inside the reactor vessel, and the steam, you know, sort of going through the pipes. It's difficult for, you know, for workers to both get access to protective equipment, which they've had a lack of, and it's difficult for them to work, you know, under those conditions with additional protective gear.